Before we begin, a word. Every voice you are about to hear could belong to a real person, and the next one could be yours. Claim a part and read it aloud at footnotesandfolly. Click. Good evening, and welcome back to Footnotes and Folly. I am Professor Reginald St. John Pemberton, and we open Book 15 of the great work of Flavius Josephus, the Antiquities of the Jews, the reign of Herod the Great. We give it complete, in plain modern English, from Whiston's grand or public domain translation. The plain rendering and the asides are my own. This is Book 15, Part 1. Herod has just taken Jerusalem and the crown, and tonight we watch him make himself secure. He executes 4 to 5 of the leading men of the fallen party of Antigonus and empties their treasuries, while sparing the 2 wise Pharisees, Pollio and Sameas, who had once counseled the city to let him in. Then he wrestles with a problem he cannot solve cleanly in the high priesthood, an office he may not hold himself and dares not hand to a rival. His answer is a tragedy. He raises his young brother-in-law Aristobulus, the last Hasmonean prince, to the sacred office, and then, sick with jealousy at how the people love the beautiful boy, has him drowned at Jericho, and weeps at the funeral he himself arranged. And over all of it hangs the shadow of Cleopatra of Egypt, forever begging Herod's lands from her lover Antony. Let us begin.
I have already described in the previous book how Josephus and Herod captured Jerusalem by force, and how they took Antigonus prisoner. I will now continue the account. Once Herod had been given control of all Judea, he promoted the ordinary citizens in Jerusalem who had supported him, but he never stopped taking revenge, day after day, on those who had chosen to side with his enemies. Above all the others, he honored Pollio the Pharisee and Sameas, Pollio's disciple. During the siege of Jerusalem, they had advised the citizens to accept Herod, and Herod rewarded them well for that advice. This same Pollio, when Herod had once been on trial for his life, had reproached Hyrcanus and the other judges by predicting that Herod, whom they were then allowing to escape, would later punish them all. In time that prediction came true, as God brought about the fulfillment of what Pollio had said. At this time, after Herod had brought Jerusalem under his power, he carried away all the royal ornaments and stripped the wealthy men of the possessions they had acquired. By doing this, he gathered a great amount of silver and gold, and he gave it all to Antony and to the friends who were with Antony. Herod also killed 45 of the leading men of Antigonus's party. He placed guards at the city gates, so that nothing could be carried out along with the bodies of the dead. The dead were searched as well, and whatever silver, gold, or other valuables were found on them were brought to the king. There was no end to the suffering Herod brought on the people. Part of this misery came from the greed of the ruling prince, who still wanted more, and part of it came from the Sabbatic year, which was still in progress and required the land to remain uncultivated, since we are forbidden to sow our fields during that year. When Antony received Antigonus as his prisoner, he first decided to keep him for his triumph. But when Antony learned that the nation was becoming rebellious, and that the Jews, because they hated Herod, still felt goodwill toward Antigonus, he decided to have Antigonus beheaded at Antioch. Otherwise, he believed, there was no way the Jews could be made quiet. Strabo of Cappadocia supports what I have said, writing in these words. Antony ordered Antigonus the Jew to be brought to Antioch and beheaded there. Antony seems to me to have been the very first man to behead a king, because he believed there was no other way to make the Jews accept Herod, whom he had made king in Antigonus's place. No tortures could force them to call Herod king, because they were so strongly attached to their former king. So Antony thought that this disgraceful death would lower the honor in which they held Antigonus's memory, and at the same time would reduce the hatred they felt toward Herod. So much for Strabo's account. After Herod had taken possession of the kingdom, Hyrcanus the high priest, who was then a prisoner among the Parthians, came back to him and was released from captivity in this way. Barzapharnes and Pacorus, the Parthian generals, had seized Hyrcanus, who had first been made high priest and later king, together with Herod's brother Phasaelus, and had carried them away into Parthia. Phasaelus could not endure the disgrace of being in chains. Believing that an honorable death was better than any kind of life under such shame, he became his own executioner, as I have already related. When Hyrcanus was brought into Parthia, King Phraates treated him very kindly, because he had already learned what an illustrious family Hyrcanus came from. For that reason he released him from his bonds and gave him a place to live at Babylon, where there were great numbers of Jews. These Jews honored Hyrcanus as their high priest and king, as did all the Jewish people who lived as far as the Euphrates, and this respect pleased him greatly. But when he heard that Herod had received the kingdom, new hopes arose in him. He had always been kindly disposed toward Herod, and he expected Herod to remember the favor he had once received from him. When Herod was on trial, and in danger of receiving a sentence of death, Hyrcanus had delivered him from that danger and from all punishment. Hyrcanus often spoke about this matter with the Jews who came to him with great affection. But they tried to keep him among them and urged him to stay. They reminded him of the kindnesses and honors they had shown him, and told him that the honors they paid him were in no way inferior to those they could pay to their high priests or their kings. They added an even stronger reason for him to remain. He could not possess those dignities in Judea because of the bodily mutilation Antigonus had inflicted on him. They also warned him that kings do not usually repay men for kindnesses they received while they were private persons, since the height of fortune commonly produces no small change in them. Although the Jews offered these arguments for his own advantage, Hyrcanus still desired to leave. Herod also wrote to him, and persuaded him to ask Frauds and the Jews there not to begrudge him the royal authority that he would share with Herod. Herod said that now was the proper time for him to repay Hyrcanus for the favors he had received from him, since Hyrcanus had brought him up and had also saved him, and it was also the proper time for Hyrcanus to receive that repayment. At the same time that Herod wrote this to Hyrcanus, he sent Sameas as his ambassador to Frauds, with many presents, and asked him in the most obliging manner not to hinder Herod from showing gratitude to his benefactor. But Herod's eagerness did not really come from gratitude. Since he had been made ruler of the country without any just claim to it, he was afraid, and with good reason, that his position might change. Therefore he hurried to get Hyrcanus into his power, or even to remove him altogether, which he later accomplished. So Hyrcanus came, full of confidence, with the permission of the king of Parthia and at the expense of the Jews, who supplied him with money. Herod received him with every possible show of respect. He gave him the highest place at public meetings and seated him above everyone else at feasts, and by these gestures deceived him. He called him his father and tried in every possible way to keep him from suspecting any treacherous design against him. Herod also took other measures to secure his government, though they caused a disturbance within his own family. Being careful not to make any illustrious man high priest of God, he sent for an obscure priest from Babylon, named Antigonus, and bestowed the high priesthood on him. Alexandra, the daughter of Hyrcanus and wife of Alexander, the son of King Aristobulus, could not endure this insult. She had borne Alexander 2 children. The son, who was remarkably handsome, was called Aristobulus. The daughter, Mariamne, was married to Herod, and was also famous for her beauty. Alexandra was deeply troubled and took it as a great indignity to her son that, while he was alive, someone else should be summoned and given the dignity of the high priesthood. Therefore she wrote to Cleopatra, with the help of a musician who assisted in arranging the delivery of her letters, asking Cleopatra to intercede with Antony, so that the high priesthood might be obtained for her son. Antony was slow to grant this request. Meanwhile, his friend Dellius came into Judea on some business. When he saw Aristobulus, he was amazed by the boy's height and beauty, and he was no less struck by Mariamne, the king's wife. He openly praised Alexandra as the mother of most beautiful children. When she came to speak with him, he advised her to have portraits made of both children and send them to Antony, saying that once Antony saw them he would deny her nothing she asked. Alexandra was encouraged by these words and sent the portraits to Antony. Dellius also spoke extravagantly, saying that these children seemed to come not from human beings but from some god. His purpose in saying this was to entice Antony into immoral pleasures with him. Antony was ashamed to send for the young woman, since she was Herod's wife, and he avoided doing so because of the reproaches he would receive from Cleopatra on that account. But he sent for the young man in the most decent manner he could, adding that Aristobulus need not come if Herod thought it too hard upon him. When this letter was brought to Herod, he did not think it safe to send Aristobulus away. The young man was very handsome, in the prime of life, 16 years old, and from so noble a family. Herod was especially unwilling to send him to Antony, the chief man among the Romans, who would abuse him in his passions, and who openly indulged in such pleasures as far as his power allowed him to do without restraint. Herod therefore wrote back that if the boy merely left the country, everything would fall into war and disorder, because the Jews were hoping for a change in the government and for another king to rule over them. Alexandra is privately plotting against my royal authority. Through Cleopatra she is trying to arrange matters so that I may be deprived of the government, and so that, by Antony's influence, this young man may take charge of public affairs in my place. Her conduct is unjust, because she would at the same time deprive her own daughter of the dignity she now holds and bring disturbances upon the kingdom, a kingdom I have worked hard for and obtained through extraordinary dangers. Still, though I remember her wicked practices well, I will not stop doing what is right. I will now give the young man the high priesthood. I appointed Antigonus before only because Aristobulus was then still so very young. After Herod had used this excuse with Antony, he decided not to allow the boy or Alexandra to be treated altogether dishonorably. His wife Mariamne also pressed him strongly to restore the high priesthood to her brother. Herod judged that doing so would serve his own interest, because once Aristobulus held the dignity, he would be unable to leave the country. So Herod called his friends together and spoke to them in this way, not at random, but with what he considered the best prudence available to him, in order to deceive the women and the friends he had taken into counsel. When Alexandra heard this unexpected promise, she was overcome both by great joy and by fear because of the suspicions against her. She began to weep and offered her defense. As for the high priesthood, I was deeply concerned over the disgrace my son was under, and I did everything I could to obtain it for him. But as for the kingdom, I have made no attempt to gain it, and even if it were offered to me for my son, I would not accept it. I will now be satisfied with my son's dignity, while you yourself hold the civil government. Through your particular ability in governing, the rest of my family has security. I am overcome by your benefits and thankfully accept this honor shown by you to my son, and from now on I will be entirely obedient. I ask you to excuse me if the nobility of my family, and the freedom of action I thought that nobility allowed me, made me act too hastily and imprudently in this matter." King Herod immediately removed Antigonus from the high priesthood. As was said before, Antigonus was not from this country, but was one of the Jews who had been carried captive beyond the Euphrates. Many tens of thousands of that people had been taken captive and had settled around Babylonia, and Antigonus came from there. He belonged to the family line of the high priests, and had long been a close friend of Herod. When Herod was first made king, he had given Antigonus that office. Now he took it away again, in order to calm the troubles within his own family. Yet what he did was plainly unlawful, because in earlier times no one who had once held that dignity had ever been deprived of it. Antiochus Epiphanes was the first to break that rule, when he removed Jesus, and made his brother Onias high priest in his place. Aristobulus was the second to do so, when he took the office from his brother Hyrcanus. Herod was the third, when he took that high office away from Antigonus and gave it, instead, to the young man Aristobulus. Herod now seemed to have healed the divisions in his family. Still, as often happens when people only appear to have been reconciled, he remained suspicious. Since Alexandra had already made attempts that pointed toward political change, he feared she would continue them if she found a suitable opportunity. So he ordered her to live in the palace, and to have nothing to do with public affairs. Her guards watched her so carefully that nothing she did in her private life from day to day was hidden. These hardships gradually wore down her patience, and she began to hate Herod. Because she had a woman's pride to the highest degree, she was deeply angered by the suspicious guard placed over her. She would rather have endured anything that might happen to her than be deprived of free speech, and under the name of an honorable guard, live in slavery and fear. So Alexandra sent a message to Cleopatra, complained at length about the condition she was in, and begged Cleopatra to do everything she could to help her. Cleopatra advised her to take her son with her and come at once to Egypt. Alexandra liked this advice and devised a plan for escaping. She had 2 coffins made as if they were meant to carry away 2 dead bodies. She put herself into one and her son into the other, and ordered the servants who knew her intention to carry them away during the night. The route was to go from there to the sea, where a ship was ready to take them into Egypt. But Aesop, one of her servants, happened to meet Sabion, one of her friends, and spoke to him about the matter, thinking he already knew of it. When Sabion learned this, he saw a chance to turn Herod's hatred of him into favor. Sabion had formerly been an enemy of Herod, and had been thought to be one of those who laid traps for Antipater, and gave him poison. He therefore told the king about Alexandra's secret scheme. Herod allowed her to go forward with the plan, and then caught her in the act. Even so, he overlooked the offense. Although he very much wanted to punish her, he did not dare inflict anything severe on her, because he knew Cleopatra would not tolerate any accusation against Alexandra, given Cleopatra's hatred of him. Instead, he made it appear that he forgave them because of his own generosity and great moderation. Nevertheless, he fully resolved to remove the young man in one way or another. He thought the deed would probably be better concealed if he did not do it at once, or immediately after what had just happened. When the Feast of Tabernacles was approaching, a festival that is very carefully observed among us, Herod let those days pass. He and the rest of the people celebrated them with great cheer. Yet the envy that rose in him at that time made him hurry toward the act he had in mind, and provoked him to carry it out. The young Aristobulus, who was now in the 17th year of his age, went up to the altar according to the law to offer the sacrifices, wearing the ornaments of the high priesthood. When he performed the sacred duties, he seemed exceptionally handsome and taller than men usually are at that age. His face showed much of the noble family from which he came. A warm zeal and affection for him appeared among the people, and the memory of the deeds of his grandfather Aristobulus was fresh in their minds. Their feelings overcame them so much that they could not keep from showing their attachment to him. They were both joyful and overwhelmed, and they mixed their good wishes with the glad acclamations they raised for him. The goodwill of the multitude became too obvious, and they spoke more rashly than was proper under a monarchy when they proclaimed the happiness they had received from his family. Because of all this, Herod resolved to complete what he had planned against the young man. After the festival was over, he was feasting at Jericho with Alexandra, who was entertaining them there. He behaved very pleasantly toward the young man and drew him into a secluded place, while at the same time playing with him in a youthful and joking way. The place was unusually hot, so the group suddenly went out together as if carried by a reckless impulse. Since it was the middle of a hot day, they stood by the fish ponds, large ponds that lay near the house, and went to cool themselves by bathing. At first they merely watched Herod's servants and acquaintances swimming. After a while, at Herod's urging, the young man went into the water among them. Then those of Herod's acquaintances whom he had appointed for the task pushed him down while he was swimming and plunged him under the water in the dimness of evening, as though it were only being done in play. They did not stop until he was completely suffocated. In this way Aristobulus was murdered. He had lived no more than 18 years in all, and had held the high priesthood for only 1 year. Antigonus then recovered the high priesthood again. When this sorrowful accident was reported to the women, their joy quickly turned into lamentation at the sight of the dead body lying before them, and their grief was excessive. The city of Jerusalem also fell into very great sorrow when the news spread. Every household regarded the calamity as if it had not happened to someone else, but as if one of their own had been killed. Alexandra was still more deeply affected, because she knew he had been deliberately destroyed. Her sorrow was greater than that of the others because she knew how the murder had been carried out. Yet she was forced to keep herself under control, because she foresaw that a greater evil might follow if she did not. Often she felt inclined to kill herself with her own hand, but she restrained herself, hoping she might live long enough to avenge the unjust murder that had been secretly committed. Indeed, she resolved to try to live longer, and to give no reason for anyone to think she suspected that her son had been killed on purpose. She believed that by doing so she might be able to take revenge at the proper time. In this way she controlled herself, so that no one would notice that she held any such suspicion. Herod, however, tried to make sure that no one outside the household would believe the child's death had happened by any design of his. For that purpose he did not merely use the ordinary signs of grief, he also burst into tears and showed what looked like real distress of soul. Perhaps his feelings were overcome on this occasion when he saw the child's face, so young and so beautiful, even though the death was thought to serve his own security. At least his grief helped provide some defense for him. As for the funeral, he saw to it that it was very magnificent. He made great preparations for a tomb in which to lay the body, provided a large quantity of spices, and buried many ornaments together with him. The display was so great that even the women, though they were in such deep sorrow, were astonished by it and received some consolation from it. Still, nothing could lessen Alexandra's grief. The memory of the dreadful affair made her sorrow deep and unyielding. So she wrote to Cleopatra, describing the treacherous plot, and how her son had been murdered. Cleopatra had already wanted to give Alexandra whatever satisfaction she could, and because she pitied Alexandra's misfortunes, she treated the matter as if it were her own. She would not leave Antony in peace, but kept urging him to punish the child's murder. She said it was disgraceful that Herod, whom Antony had made king over a kingdom that did not belong to him at all, should commit such terrible crimes against those who were truly of royal blood. Antony was persuaded by these arguments. When he came to Laodicea, he sent orders for Herod to come and defend himself over what had been done to Aristobulus, since such a treacherous plan was not acceptable if Herod had any part in it. Herod was afraid, both of the accusation itself and of Cleopatra's hostility toward him, for she was always trying to make Antony hate him. He therefore decided to obey the summons, since he had no possible way to avoid it. He left his uncle Joseph in charge of his government and public affairs, and privately ordered him that if Antony killed him, Joseph must immediately kill Mariamne too. Herod loved this wife tenderly, and he feared the injury that would be done to him if, after his death, she should be given to another man because of her beauty. What he really meant, however, was that Antony had fallen in love with her after previously hearing something of her beauty. After giving Joseph this order, and with no firm hope that he would escape alive, Herod went away to Antony. Joseph then administered the public affairs of the kingdom, and for that reason he was very often with Mariamne, both because his duties required it, and because he owed respect to the queen. He frequently spoke about Herod's kindness and his great affection for her. When the women, especially Alexandra, turned his talk into feminine teasing, Joseph became too eager to prove the king's feelings. He went so far as to mention the order he had received, using it as proof that Herod could not live without Mariamne, and that if some disaster happened to him, he could not bear to be separated from her even after death. That was what Joseph said. But the women, quite naturally, did not take this as a sign of Herod's strong love for them, but as proof of his harsh treatment of them. Even if he himself were dead, they still could not escape destruction or a tyrannical death. This statement of Joseph's later became the basis for the women's severe suspicions about him. At this time, a rumor spread through the city of Jerusalem among Herod's enemies that Antony had tortured Herod and put him to death. As was natural, this report troubled those in the palace, and especially the women. Alexandra then tried to persuade Joseph to leave the palace and flee with them to the standards of the Roman legion, which was then encamped near the city under the command of Julius as a guard for the kingdom. She argued that if any disturbance broke out around the palace, they would be safer there, since the Romans would be favorable to them. Besides this, they hoped to obtain the highest authority if Antony only saw Mariamne. Through her they would recover the kingdom and lack nothing that they could reasonably hope for, because of their royal descent. While they were still discussing these plans, letters arrived from Herod about all his affairs. They proved the rumor false and contradicted what they had expected. When Herod came to Antony, he quickly regained his favor by the gifts he had brought from Jerusalem. After speaking with Antony, he soon persuaded him to give up his anger, so that Cleopatra's arguments had less power than Herod's arguments and gifts in restoring their friendship. Antony said that it was not right to demand an account from a king concerning the affairs of his government, because then he would be no king at all. Those who had given him that authority ought to allow him to use it. Antony said the same thing to Cleopatra, telling her it would be best for her not to interfere busily in the actions of the king's government. Herod wrote an account of all this, and he added at length the other honors he had received from Antony, how he sat beside him when Antony heard legal cases, and how he ate with him every day. He said he enjoyed these favors despite the accusations Cleopatra kept making against him so bitterly. She greatly desired his country, and she urgently begged Antony to give the kingdom to her, doing all she could to get Herod removed. Yet Herod said that he still found Antony just toward him, and that he no longer feared harsh treatment from him. He expected soon to return with an even stronger assurance of Antony's favor in his reign and in his management of public affairs. He also wrote that there was no longer any hope for Cleopatra's greedy temper, because Antony had given her Celesyria instead of what she wanted. By doing this, Antony had both pacified her and freed himself from her requests that Judea be granted to her. When these letters arrived, the women gave up their plan of fleeing to the Romans, which they had considered while they thought Herod was dead. Yet their intention did not remain secret. After the king had escorted Antony on his way against the Parthians, he returned to Judea. Then both his sister Salome and his mother told him about Alexandra's plans. Salome added something further against Joseph, though it was only a slander. She said that he had often had criminal conversation with Mariamne. She said this because she had long hated Mariamne. When they had disputes with one another, Mariamne spoke very freely and reproached the others for the low rank of their birth. Herod's affection for Mariamne was always very strong, so he was immediately disturbed by this accusation, and could not endure the torments of jealousy. Still his love for her restrained him from doing anything rash to her. His intense affection and jealousy together made him question Mariamne privately about Joseph. She denied the charge under oath, and said everything that an innocent woman could possibly say in her own defense. Little by little, the king was persuaded to give up the suspicion and set aside his anger toward her. Overcome by his passion for his wife, he apologized to her for having seemed to believe what he had heard about her. He thanked her repeatedly for her modest conduct, and declared the extraordinary affection and kindness he felt for her. At last, as commonly happens between lovers, they both began to weep and embraced one another with the greatest tenderness. Yet was not that order you gave, that if any harm came to you from Antony, I, who had caused none of it, should die with you, a sign of your love for me? When these words fell from her, the king was shocked. He immediately released her from his arms, cried out, and tore his hair with his own hands. Now I have clear proof that Joseph had criminal conversation with my wife. He would never have revealed what I told him privately and alone unless there had been such great familiarity and firm trust between them. In this passion Herod nearly killed his wife. But because his love for her still overpowered him, he restrained his anger, though not without lasting grief and distress of mind. Nevertheless, he ordered Joseph to be killed without even allowing him to come into his presence. As for Alexandra, he bound her and kept her in custody as the cause of all this trouble. At this time Syria was in disorder because Cleopatra kept urging Antony to seize other people's territories. She persuaded him to take lands away from their rulers and give them to her, and she had great power over him because his love had made him her servant. She was naturally greedy and stopped at no crime. She had already poisoned her brother, though he was only 15, because she knew he was to become king of Egypt. Through Antony she also had her sister Arsinoe killed, while Arsinoe was seeking protection at Diana's temple in Ephesus. Whenever there was any hope of gaining money, Cleopatra would violate both temples and tombs. No holy place, however sacred people considered it, was safe from her, if it contained ornaments she wanted, and no place was too profane for her to treat with the greatest wickedness if it could satisfy any part of her greed. Yet even all this was not enough for so extravagant a woman, enslaved as she was to her desires. She always imagined she lacked whatever she could think of, and she did everything she could to obtain it. For that reason she continually pushed Antony to deprive others of their kingdoms and give them to her. As she traveled through Syria with him, she plotted to bring the country into her possession. Antony killed Lysanias, the son of Ptolemy, accusing him of having brought the Parthians into those regions. Cleopatra also asked Antony to give her Judea and Arabia, and for that purpose urged him to take those countries from their present governors. Antony was so completely overcome by this woman that it seemed not merely that her conversation had conquered him, but that he had somehow been bewitched into doing whatever she wished. Still, the worst parts of her injustice made him ashamed, and he did not always agree to commit the open enormities she tried to persuade him to do. So, in order neither to deny her entirely nor, by doing everything she commanded, appear openly wicked, Antony took parts of both countries away from their former governors and gave them to her. In this way he gave her the cities within the river Eleutherus as far as Egypt, except Tyre and Sidon. He knew those two had been free cities from the time of their ancestors, although Cleopatra often pressed him to give them to her too. After Cleopatra had obtained this much, she accompanied Antony on his expedition toward Armenia, as far as Euphrates. Then she returned, came to Apamia and Damascus, and went on to Judea. There Herod met her and leased from her the parts of Arabia, along with the revenues she received from the region around Jericho. That country produces balsam, the most valuable drug found there, and it grows only in that place. The region also has many palm trees, excellent of their kind. While Cleopatra was there and often in Herod's company, she tried to draw the king into an illicit relationship. She made no attempt to hide her pursuit of such pleasures. Perhaps she felt some desire for him, or more probably, she was setting a trap, hoping to ensnare him through adultery. In any case, she appeared to be overcome with love for him. Herod had long disliked Cleopatra, knowing that she was a troublesome woman to everyone. At that moment he thought her especially deserving of hatred if her attempt came from lust. He also considered stopping her intrigues by killing her, if that was what she was trying to do. Herod refused her proposals and called a council of his friends to ask whether he should kill her now that he had her in his power. He argued that by doing so he would free all those whom she already troubled, and whom she was expected to trouble still more in the future, from a multitude of evils. He also said that this would greatly benefit Antony himself, since Cleopatra would certainly not remain faithful to him if some occasion or necessity arose in which he needed her loyalty. But when Herod was inclined to follow this plan, his friends would not allow it. They told him first that it was not right to attempt so great a deed, and thereby bring himself into the utmost danger. They pressed him strongly and begged him to do nothing rash. Antony, they said, would never endure it, even if someone clearly showed him that it was for his own advantage. The very appearance that Herod had deprived Antony of Cleopatra's company by a violent and treacherous act would probably inflame Antony's affection for her even more than before. Nor did it seem that Herod could offer any defense of sufficient weight for such an attempt, since it would be made against a woman who at that time held the highest rank of any woman in the world. As for any advantage that might be expected from the act, even if one could suppose there was any, it would still be condemned because of the insolence Herod would be taking upon himself. These considerations made it clear that if he did this, he would fill his government with great and lasting troubles, both for himself and for his descendants. Yet he still had the power to reject the wickedness Cleopatra was urging on him, and to come away with honor. By frightening Herod in this way, and by showing him the danger he would probably run if he attempted it, his friends restrained him. So he treated Cleopatra kindly, gave her presents, and escorted her on her way to Egypt. Meanwhile Antony subdued Armenia. He sent Artabazus, the son of Tigranes, in chains to Egypt, together with Artabazus's children and governors, and gave them to Cleopatra as a gift, along with all the royal ornaments he had taken from that kingdom. Artaxias, the eldest of Artabazus's sons, escaped at that time and took the kingdom of Armenia. Much later, however, he was driven out by Archelaus and Nero Caesar, when they restored Tigranes, his younger brother, to that kingdom. As for the tribute Herod had to pay Cleopatra for the country Antony had given her, he dealt fairly with her, because he thought it unsafe to give Cleopatra any reason to hate him. As for the king of Arabia, whose tribute Herod had undertaken to pay her, for a time he paid Herod the amount owed, which came to 200 talents. Later, however, he became very stingy and slow in making payments. He could barely be persuaded to pay even parts of the tribute, and he was unwilling to pay those parts without taking deductions.
And there we will pause, with Herod secure on his throne, the last Hasmonean high priest dead in a swimming bath at Jericho, and Cleopatra's greed gnawing at the borders of his kingdom. He has shown us already the two faces he will wear all his life: the shrewd, generous statesman, and the man who murders whatever he fears, even in his own house. Next time, in Part 2, the war Cleopatra maneuvers Herod into against the Arabs, the tremendous earthquake that kills 30,000 and nearly breaks his army's nerve, and the great gamble of his life for when his patron Antony falls at Actium, Herod sails to the victor Octavian at Rhodes to plead for his very crown. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly. One last thing before you go. There is a part on our stage still wanting a voice, and it may as well be yours. Come and read for us at footnotesandfolly.click, and be in the next telling rather than only watching it. And before the lamp goes out, a small request. If something tonight taught you, or surprised you, or simply delighted you, do leave a comment and tell me what it was. And if there is a work, an author, or a tale you should like me to take up next, set it down there as well. I read every one, and many an episode has begun its life as a viewer's suggestion. Until next time.